Welcome back, Master Gardener trainees, to your next module. This one starts on citrus problems, citrus diseases, maybe even a little bit of a discussion about some of the disorders nutritionally that you might see in citrus. Before we move on, I do want to give you a little bit of a caveat that citrus greening, which is a really horrific disease that we've seen in citrus in the last decade or so, has pretty much wiped out the crop commercially. And a lot of the diseases that we might be discussing here would seem almost superficial or insignificant at this point in time. The main reason I am discussing citrus diseases beyond greening is because we still do have quite a few folks that just from a backyard standpoint want to grow citrus. And normally what I've been telling them is it's perfectly fine. Understand that it's going to get citrus greening, and I'm going to talk more about that later. But it's going to get citrus greening, and as long as it's producing fruit, though, that they're okay with eating, it's perfectly safe. It's not going to hurt them or anything like that. As long as it tastes good, go ahead and eat it. So from a home standpoint, if you're just putting out a handful of trees, you don't have much of a financial investment into those if you lose them from greening. Commercial side of things is a very different story, though. So really focusing in, dialing into information that homeowners might need to know about from a master gardener standpoint. So that's just a little piece of info to kind of set the story for where we're headed here. So in our objectives for this set of modules, I want to talk just very briefly about the history of citrus in Florida. It does have a very interesting history, in my opinion. Of course, I'm a nerd. Talk a little bit about some of the finer points of culturing citrus in the backyard, which is a little bit different compared to our landscaping plants and a lot of our other fruit trees. Then we'll probably break the modules up just a little bit and talk about pest control, because we do have some issues with mites. We have issues with insects. Those are two different critters, by the way, so go back to entomology to figure out the differences there. Also, quite a few diseases. And again, we'll come back around to greening. And we may touch a little bit on nutritional disorders as well. So as you can see here from this older poster, there are so many types of citrus and citrus-like fruits that are out there. Some that are very beautiful, some that we see in culinary dishes, or ones that we just like to eat as fresh fruit right off the tree. But others, even like that ugly fruit that you see up there, are a little bit unusual, a little bit different. Some of these are over onto the tropical side of things and just can't survive in our area. Others are quite hardy and can withstand more cold damage than others, like the kumquats, the tiny little kumquat, citrus-like, or a cousin to the typical citrus that we're familiar with. It's grown right here around Dade City and is very popular in a lot of the dishes locally, but also in some of the big major restaurants in the big city. So, just so that we're all on the same page, we can talk a little bit about some of the typical parts of a citrus fruit from the outside in. The outside has that kind of leathery rind, or what we call the exo, meaning outer, exocarp, outer skin. That's going to be comprised of lots and lots of tiny, tiny, tiny little pits or oil glands where the essential oils are going to be contained. And anytime you, of course, touch these, cut these in any way whatsoever, you're spreading those oils around. You move a little bit more to the inside and you have this internal middle layer called the mesocarp, meso meaning middle. And just to the inside of that, the most internalized layer then is the endo or interior portion called the endocarp, comprised of carpels or sections, individual sections. Now remember, this started out as a flower at one point in time. So you have the carpel, and you also then have these locules or little sections that are filled with the juice, and then of course the seed inside, right at the center. So these are produced through sexual reproduction. That's why we've got the seed in there. Some of these seeds, depending on the fruit, is going to be sterile. Some of them are actually going to be able to produce citrus plants. A lot of them won't be true to type because citrus is grafted. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later on. And that was mentioned in your propagation modules too. So what we get from the seed is typically not true to what the original plant that fruit came from was producing in terms of the look, the taste, the feel, the amount, the sugar content, and whatnot of those original fruits. So from an economic impact, now I will say that with citrus greening, it has really taken a toll on the citrus industry in Florida. And most of the numbers that you see here have really been cut in at least half. Citrus alone, just citrus alone, was well into the billions of dollars prior to the citrus greening epidemic. Right now, data for 2017, about $800 million a year industry of the citrus fruit. That's about 45,000 jobs, again, at least half of what it once was. But if you combine all of the different value-added products, the labor, the land, the equipment, and all these kinds of things that go in together, we're still looking at about an $8.6 billion a year economic impact in the state of Florida. Again, this is much lower than it used to be, and certainly much lower than we wish it was. Right now, we've got around 70 million trees in the state of Florida, citrus trees, in commercial production across about 437,000 acres. That's around 4,000 commercial producers that are on record. 78 million boxes, that's actually up a little bit in estimation over the 15-16 seasons. So that was good news. It was up just a little bit. But we still comprise about 65% of the total U.S. production of citrus, which comes out of Florida. And the great majority of that, about 90%, is for the juicing industry. And I'll come back around to that in a few minutes. So the history of citrus in Florida, a lot of people kind of see citrus as being synonymous with Florida and Disney World. I mean, what are the two things you think of when you think Florida if you're not a native? Disney World and oranges. Citrus is not native, but it was brought here by the Spaniards because, number one, it was fairly easy and to keep for long periods of time on voyages. We now know that it was good at keeping away scurvy because of the vitamin C. It tasted real good, but it made for a really good bartering tool and a gift with natives. So the Spaniards brought it over sometime in the 1500s. It was then transported by the Native American Indians throughout the state, throughout the region, and it did not become a commercial industry really until the late 1800s which started up in Georgia, northern Florida, parts of Alabama, South Carolina, and with many successive freezes over the decades, most all of the production commercially pushed itself further and further down into the peninsula of Florida to the point that it pretty much starts now around Ocala and then pushes further south. So as we began to process it into juice, which required more oranges, we started to have more increased acreage over the last couple hundred years as well, until we got to the point that it was a worldwide commodity. So as you can see here with this map across the state, the commercial orange growing region in Florida, and we know we grow them further north, and but don't get a lot of production out of them because of the potential for cold, pushes just up to the north of Pasco through Hernando and cuts across the state toward Volusia County. That's for orange. In comparison to grapefruit. If you notice, grapefruit growing region really does start out somewhere just south of Tampa Bay and then skirts across the state over toward southern part of Volusia County and toward Daytona. So grapefruit, this tells us that it's much less cold tolerant. So this is an older picture out of a book, but a really nice representation of the cold hardiness among all the different types of citrus, starting with the most tender on the left-hand side, the Mexican limes, lemons, grapefruit, the great big huge pomelo, all the way across over to the most cold hardy, which are the kumquats. Citrus cousin, very tiny. We call those citrus candy because you can pop the whole thing in your mouth, rind and all. Grown right here in Dade City area, and even gives us our Kumquat Festival every year. So these are very much a specialty fruit, but very interesting. If you haven't had any of those, definitely need to get some November through January or February of every year. So Florida's citrus industry then really started to boom because we have a warm, wet summer. And that warm, wet summer produces a very high sugar and juice content with a thin peel inside of our oranges, our fruits, which makes it easier to process. But because we have the warm, wet summer, that also gives us a lot of insects, a lot of disease, and even a lot of wind damage and potential to spread these things around. So we end up with a lot of blemishes. So the fruit at one time before greening especially was really easy to produce in Florida because it was warm and it was wet, and we got really good juicing fruit, but we didn't get good handheld fruit, fresh fruit, because of the blemish potential that we would have from the insects and disease. And that's why we end up with the production being 90% for processing or for juicing, which was perfectly fine. And really we had orange gold in Florida for many, many decades. And it was being grown and still is today commercially pretty much from Ocala all the way down to Homestead. Miami. So from a master gardener standpoint, you may have quite a few people that will call the office or come in, especially from up north. They have this idea of a idealized citrus that they want in their yard. They need to know about how to buy and plant their citrus tree. One of the things we usually always tell them is bigger is not necessarily better when they're looking around through commercial nurseries and even some of the big box stores. There are a lot of different types of varieties that are out there. We're looking for good quality, things that taste good, that are true to type, that don't have roots that are circling in the pot, that are not root bound, that are not diseased plants, broken plants. We want them to look nice and healthy. And we want to make sure that they're planting them at the same depth and that they don't need to come in with any sort of special amendments or fertilizers when they first set out these plants. Remember our moniker, plant them high, they won't die. Plant them low, they won't grow. That applies to our landscape plants, our fruit trees, and to our citrus plants. Also keep in mind what I mentioned a little while ago was that these are not your typical fruit tree because they've been grafted. We have a rootstock with a graft union to a scion on the top. Our desired citrus is going to have certain colors, certain smells, certain sugar qualities, the ability to produce more than other types of varieties and cultivars. So we take whatever scion from orange, grapefruit, tangerine, whatnot, and we then graft that to a rootstock that's going to be more drought tolerant, that's going to be less susceptible to nematodes, to certain diseases that are predominant in a particular environment. So we're looking for the best rootstock to give us the best quality fruit on a different scion. So we're literally grafting two very different types of plants together out of the same family to get a high quality product. So commercial trees are going to be grafted, and so are the ones that the homeowners are going to be finding. And so there are some specific things that we need to make sure we mention to them and things we need to be looking for when they tell us they're having problems with citrus trees. Number one, they may often call and say, you know, I've been getting really great fruit for years from my citrus tree, and I've noticed that over the last year or two, the citrus looks different. It doesn't taste as good. It's not producing as well. What's wrong with my tree? Most people think, well, it probably needs more fertilizer. It needs more water, right? In many cases, they're actually getting fruit off of the rootstock, which is not the variety that we want. That's not the desirable characteristics. If you look here on the right, this citrus tree that's been potted, sitting in a pot, you can see the rootstock. You can see that little green sprig coming out of the rootstock. If that's where we're getting fruit, that's not going to be what we want. That's coming off the rootstock, not the scion. Plus, that's going to be competing for nutrients, and we want to prune that away. And we can prune those away pretty much any time they start to pop out. You can also see that swelling there that leads up to the scion. Sometimes the swelling's kind of large. Other times it's very nondescript. Like right in the middle of the slide, in the middle, you see the very dark green rootstock with just a very slight swelling leading up to the scion above that's more of the tan color. And you see the red arrow pointing to the bright green stem. That's coming off the rootstock. We want to prune that away. That's not desirable tissue. But the one to the just above that red arrow that's more tan, we'd want to keep that. That's coming off the scion. And then over there to the far left, you're seeing very much the same concept. You can see, and this one is where it's just not very obvious, but you can see a little bit of a swelling there to the upper portion of that stem that shows us where the graft union took place. But that bright green little tuft or flush of growth there is coming off of the rootstock, and we'd want to remove that. Some of the other issues is crowding. A lot of times we tend to like to stick citrus, like a lot of our other plants, in places that are just too darn small for them. Citrus trees can easily grow up to be 30 feet tall, 15 feet wide, and as you can see from the pictures here, these plants are planted way too close together. They're going to grow in together, they're going to be brushing past each other, breaking limbs, there's not going to be any airflow, more disease, more insects, it's up close to the fence. Wrong plant, wrong place, even if you wanted citrus. And take a look at this photo. You can see very classic citrus with a grown adult standing there. This is a huge plant that needs a lot of room and quite a bit of respect. If From a planting standpoint, we mentioned that idea of planting them high, they won't die, planting them low, they won't grow. Same thing applies to citrus. We're looking for the uppermost root, and take a look at this root ball here. Uppermost root, we want that to be above ground. That usually equals a couple of inches, even 10% of the entire root ball, whether it's coming out of a pot or a cage or a balled and burlapped plant. We want to use the same type of practices, make sure we have that plant as vertical as we possibly can. We want to remove any plastic, any wires, any of the cages, pull the burlap back away from the root ball as far as we can get it. Don't use any kind of soil amendments. We're backfilling with the same soil that came out of that same hole, but we're definitely keeping that plant, upper 10% of that root ball, out of the ground. Citrus especially does not like wet feet. They need a lot of oxygen. Roots. So as you can see here from this illustration, this plant would be planted way too deep, and this is simply not going to survive. All the roots are in the upper surface of the soil. They're not going to be searching down toward water and down toward nutrients like the one just prior. And here's a very good illustration too to show you this one's obviously way too deep here. And I like these pictures because they show that the upper portion, about 10% or so, of that root ball is above ground. You can see this here. This is citrus actually. So this is very good to show you this is not necessarily a bad thing. We want to make sure that it's strong and that it's sitting vertically, that root ball in there before we start to backfill it. But we want the upper 10% of the roots out of the ground. So look for the uppermost root, keep it above ground, maybe a couple of inches. That may be what that equates to. From an irrigation standpoint, just like any of our other plants, it is essential for our young trees to get them to grow that we're irrigating them to get them established. From a young tree standpoint, it's to get them to grow and get them established. Mature trees, though, also need irrigation to increase their yield and to get a good piece of fruit. That's not necessarily the case with our other established landscape plants. A lot of times they don't need supplemental irrigation, but our citrus will to get a good yield from them. Normally, we're looking at using sprinklers, especially micro irrigation sprinklers, where we're getting a good amount of irrigation into the root zone and we're not wasting it, not putting it overhead so that it's evaporating or that we're putting moisture on the leaves where it's not necessary. Typically 1 to 2 times a week, so that we're at least getting an inch every week during the warm periods, even when we're getting a lot of rain, and at least getting an inch every 2 weeks during the cool periods of the year. Very, very important that we continue to irrigate our citrus plant. And we want to make sure we're putting it directly onto the root ball during establishment with a hose. Just do this by hand in 5-gallon buckets and don't depend on the little impact or micro heads. These take quite a bit of water to get them established early on. Fertilizer, again, when you first plant that citrus, it's not going to be taking up any sort of fertilizer. You're going to want to wait several months, more than likely, at least until it's established. And remember, the bigger the diameter of the tree, the longer it takes to establish. So selecting a smaller citrus tree is not a bad idea to get it started. It'll take less water, take less time to get it established. But citrus certainly needs fertilizer to produce good fruit and to stay nice and healthy. The type of fertilizer is really not that important. There are some out there that are extremely expensive. You don't have to go with the expensive stuff. You just really need to go with what your soil test tells you need, a good all-around balanced fertilizer that has a micro package in it. And we know that fertilization is definitely tied to the amount of rainfall and irrigation. So the more rainfall, the more irrigation that we're putting out or having to put out. Usually we're having to fertilize a little bit more because we might be losing some of that fertilizer through leaching or runoff. But we're looking at rate, we're looking at analysis, timing, and placement of the fertilizer as being way more important than the type of fertilizer. Citrus ideally likes to be somewhere between 6 and 6.5 on the pH scale, but a 5.5 to even a 7, they can tolerate pretty well. One thing I would advise you to do is stay away from the tree and shrub fertilizer spikes. Remember, we have sugar sands. If these things do release nutrients, it's going to go straight down. It's not going to enter into the root system whatsoever, and you're going to starve your trees. So please avoid those. Okay. Let's talk about fertilization for a young tree. So one that's 1 year old, 2 years old, somewhere in that area. Definitely we can be fertilizing them basically the same way until they're about 5 in most cases, unless they just really grow very quickly. Normally what you're doing is you're starting out with about a half a pound of nitrogen for the first year, and you will slowly, gradually increase your amount of nitrogen for each application until you get up around 5 years of age, when we would think of that as being a more mature tree. Simple analysis that's balanced at 828 is very, very good, very easy to find on the shelf. But you do want to go out about 6 inches from the trunk of the tree up to about 2 feet past the edge of the canopy, so that you're ensuring you're spreading it into the root zone and not staying too close to the trunk or getting out past the root zone so that the plant can't take it up. Young tree fertilization for the first few years, every 6 to 8 weeks from March to the end of October is when you want to be fertilizing young citrus trees. That's a little bit compared to a mature tree. Mature tree, general rule of thumb we use, the circumference of that tree in inches equals the pounds of fertilizer you need to be putting out per year. And you can see this gentleman measuring that tree just to kind of sink home that concept. Again, going with a cheap 828 balanced fertilizer, but here we're starting with our placement about a foot out away from the trunk up to about 3 feet past the edge of the canopy. We're spreading it out uniformly. Timing about 4 times a year. March, May, August, and October is when you're fertilizing mature trees. So very large trees and ones that are 4 or 5 years old is when you'd start this fertilization regime. Cultivation. So this is a biggie here. Couple of big things. Weeds. We know weeds compete with all of our landscape plants and our fruit trees, but certainly with citrus for fertilizer, for water. They also harbor disease and they harbor insects. So controlling weeds is one of the most important things you can do to have very good backyard citrus production. For the most part, that's going to be mechanical control, meaning you're pulling them, you're raking those, you're hoeing those yourself. There are plenty of chemicals that you could be applying, but you do risk doing some damage to your citrus in this case. So if you just got one or two trees, going out kind of raking around those every now and then is going to be your best bet. Do not mulch your citrus trees though. Do your best to avoid, it kind of goes against the grain, but do your best to avoid mulching citrus. Again, they do not like wet feet. They have a propensity to rot, especially at the base. And mulching is not really going to help us in terms of holding in enough moisture or preventing weeds in this particular case. It's going to cut off the oxygen that the roots need. So the benefits are outweighed by the negatives in this particular case. If you just can't help yourself from mulching around your citrus for aesthetic reasons, go at least 8 feet out from the base of that tree before you begin to mulch, and only put down a layer maybe 2 inches thick at the very most. So that one's a biggie. Pruning. We have learned that pruning, there's right ways and wrong ways certainly to prune any kind of our trees, but that we shouldn't be pruning to try to control size. That goes back to right plant, right place. And we certainly shouldn't be trying to prune citrus just to shape it, because we are going to affect the fruiting and the overall health. Pruning in citrus needs to be done to remove damaged, diseased tissue, dead wood, suckers that are coming out from the rootstock, to rejuvenate an old neglected tree to try to get it healthy and vigorous again. When we prune, we are telling that plant to produce new growth. And any of that new growth is very susceptible to infection, and it's very susceptible to cold damage. So if you really must prune your citrus, prune it in the spring, maybe early fall, and don't take any more than 15 to 20% of that new growth, because if you are putting out a flush of fresh, susceptible, tender growth and there's a chance at cold damage, you could possibly lose that entire tree. And on occasion, believe it or not, they can get sunburned or scalded, and you may need to take off some of that tissue wherever they didn't have very good leaf cover. So a lot of times you will have homeowners say, why does the fruit on my tree not look like the fruit in the store? And there's a very good answer for that, because those growers cannot sell fruit that has a blemish. We just don't want to buy it, even though the fruit inside is usually perfectly fine and tastes just as good. We want it to be blemish free. So they're going to put a lot of time, a lot of labor, and a lot of chemical controls into trying to prevent blemishes for anything that's going to be sold in a store. And like we said earlier, with the history of citrus in Florida, that's pretty hard because it's so warm and it's so wet here. We're going to get diseases, we're going to get insects that might not affect the flesh, but certainly affect the outside, the exocarp or the rind. That's why we tend to juice most all of our citrus in Florida. So having blemishes on our fruit coming out of the backyard is not a bad thing. It's not going to harm us whatsoever. Just like we say about grasses and weeds, if it's green, mow it. In this case, if it tastes good, eat it, is the way that we look at citrus. So that's part one of citrus discussion. I'm going to come back in just a few minutes with part two, and that concerns pest control.